Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Welcome back to another episode of Who Will Be the Biggest Flop? This is part 6, and it's been another crazy week at the box office. And just like last week, one of our 6 contestants is no longer in theaters. So we'll begin this episode with its final box office numbers. So let's have a big round of applause for the entry from Warner Bros. Discovery and DC Studios. That completely underperforming superhero movie, The Flash, starring everyone's favorite wackadoodle actor, Ezra Miller. For its final update, there were no weekend earnings, but there was some weekday box office revenue earned last week, $424,000, which brought its final domestic total up to $107.2 million. Internationally, the movie had a more significant increase of $3.6 million to bring what I believe will be its final international total to $160.4 million. So globally, the movie earned just over another $4 million to bring its final total global gross box office up to around $267.6 million. Given that this is probably the movie's final box office update, unless it earns more money internationally, there is no projection going forward. But the movie's estimated break-even point range is $550 million to $660 million, which is based on multiplying its $220 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. Thus, the movie's final global gross box office loss ranges between $282.4 million and $392.4 million. Dividing that range by 2 yields a range of possible loss for Warner Bros. Discovery and DC Studios of $141.2 million to $196.2 million. These are formidable numbers that, for now, will place The Flash into first place, but I don't believe it will remain there for long. That brings us to 2 movies that opened this weekend that have adversely impacted all of our contestants. So let's have a warm welcome for the movies Barbie and Oppenheimer. While we don't typically talk about financially successful movies on who will be the biggest flop, these 2 movies are exceptions with their huge opening weekend box office numbers. Barbie opened with $155 million domestically and $182 million internationally for a global opening weekend box office of $337 million. So it is well on its way to breaking even probably as soon as next weekend. And Oppenheimer opened with $80.5 million domestically and $93.7 million internationally for a global opening weekend box office of $174.2 million. So between these 2 movies and Sound of Freedom, which came in 3rd place in this weekend's overall domestic box office, our next contestant came in 4th place overall. So please give a warm welcome to our returning contestant vying to earn the coveted Biggest Flop title. The entry from Paramount Pictures, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, starring Tom Cruise. Unlike Tom Cruise's previous movie from last year, the extremely successful Top Gun Maverick, his newest Mission Impossible movie is going to be a huge flop. Domestically, the movie only managed to earn another $19.5 million, which was a 64% drop from its opening weekend, to bring its domestic total box office up to $118.8 million. Internationally, the movie did a lot better, earning $97.1 million to bring its international total up to $252.1 million. Globally, the movie earned another $135.9 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $370.9 million. Now, while that may sound impressive, you need to remember that the movie has a $290 million production budget, which, when we multiply by 2.5 and 3.0 to calculate a mid and upper range estimated break-even point range, we get values of $725 million and $870 million respectively. So using the movie's current average global weekly drop of 42.19% and 1 standard deviation above and below based on the previous 6 films in the franchise, we get projected possible final global gross box office values of $521.5 million, $557 million, and $602.4 million, which, as the chart shows, are well below the movie's estimated break-even point range. So right now, the movie is looking at possibly losing as much as $122.6 million to $348.5 million in global gross box office revenue. And when we divide that range by 2, it looks like Paramount Pictures could lose somewhere between $61.3 million to $174.2 million, which puts Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 into second place behind The Flash. And that brings us to our third contestant, which dropped way down into 5th place in this weekend's domestic box office. So let's have a warm welcome for Kathleen Kennedy's truly terrible entry from Disney and Lucasfilm, Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction, starring the 81-year-old Harrison Ford. The movie only took in a rather pathetic $6.7 million domestically, which brings its domestic total to $159 million. Internationally, the movie brought in another $19 million to bring its international box office total up to $176 million. So globally, the movie earned another $32.7 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $335 million. So when we project that forward by using the movie's current average weekly drop of 34.38%, and 1 standard deviation above and below, as well as 2 standard deviations above, we get a projected final global gross box office range for Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction between $387.1 million to $403.3 million. Kathleen Kennedy must be crying her little bloodshot eyes out right now, because given the movie's estimated break-even point range of $736.8 million to $884.1 million, which is obtained by multiplying the movie's bloated production budget of $294.7 million by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction currently stands to lose somewhere between $333.5 million to $497 million in global gross box office revenue. Wow! So dividing that range by 2 yields an updated possible range of losses for Disney and Lucasfilm of $166.7 million to $248.5 million, which places Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction back into first place as it has been since it opened 3 weeks ago. This moves The Flash into second place and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 into third place. And that brings us to our fourth contestant, whose domestic box office earnings landed it in 7th position overall. So let's have a warm welcome for the entry from Disney Pixar, the animated movie Elemental. The movie earned another $5.8 million domestically to bring its domestic box office total up to $137.2 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $33 million to bring its international box office up to $219.4 million. Globally, the movie earned another $44.9 million to bring its current global gross box office total to $356.6 million. Projecting forward, using the overall Pixar movie average weekly drop of 28.4% and 1 standard deviation above and below, yields a possible final global gross box office range of $429.7 million to $540.9 million. So there's still a possibility that Elemental could break even, since its estimated break-even point is $500 million, which is obtained by multiplying the movie's $200 million production budget by 2.5. But that new projected range is narrower than last week's and slightly lower on the upper end. So Elemental currently stands to lose anywhere from $0 to $70.3 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2, means that Disney Pixar may lose anywhere from $0 to $35.2 million. Thus, there's still the possibility of the movie being disqualified, so Elemental goes into last place behind Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. And this brings us to our 5th contestant, which came in 9th place overall in this weekend's domestic box office. So let's have a warm welcome for the entry from Paramount Pictures and Hasbro, Transformers: Rise of the Beasts. The movie earned another $1.1 million at the domestic box office to bring its current domestic total up to $155.6 million. It also earned another $3.3 million internationally to bring its total international box office up to $271.5 million. So its global box office increased by $6.2 million to bring its current global gross box office revenue up to $427.1 million. Currently, its individual weekly drops have an overall average of 40.94%. So projecting forward by also taking into account the average weekly drops that are up to one standard deviation away based on the previous 6 Transformers movies, yields a projected final global gross box office range of $433.5 million to $436 million, which is lower than last week's projected range. Given that the movie's estimated break-even point ranges between $500 million to $600 million, which is based on multiplying the movie's $200 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, we get a potential range of global gross box office loss of $60.1 million to $166.5 million. When we divide that range by 2, we get a potential loss for the studios of $30 million to $83.3 million, which places Transformers Rise of the Beasts currently into 4th place ahead of Elemental and behind Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which currently sits in 3rd place. It's now time for our 6th and final contestant, which came in 11th place overall in this weekend's domestic box office. So please give a warm welcome to Disney's live-action race swap remake of The Little Mermaid. The movie earned another $687,000 at the domestic box office, bringing its current domestic total up to $296.1 million. Internationally, the movie did apparently earn more money over the past 2 weeks, so its current international total is up to $260.3 million. Globally, the movie is now up to $556.4 million. So projecting forward, using an approximate average weekly drop of 36.42%, the movie's final global gross box office will probably top out at around $564.6 million. Next, The Little Mermaid has a break-even point of $780 million, which is calculated by adding the movie's $250 million production budget and the $140 million spent by Disney to market the movie, which yields a total cost of $390 million. That then gets multiplied by 2 to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves. So the movie's total global gross box office loss will probably be around $215.4 million. When we divide that by 2, Disney's net loss on The Little Mermaid is currently projected to be around $107.7 million and puts the movie into 4th place. Thus, after another crazy week at the box office, Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction sits in 1st place, The Flash sits in 2nd place, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 sits in 3rd place, The Little Mermaid sits in 4th place, Transformers Rise of the Beasts sits in 5th place, and Elemental comes in last place. Be sure to tune in next week for another exciting episode of Who Will Be the Biggest Flop? Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.